The gavel froze mid-air as the courtroom door burst open. All eyes turned to the disheveled woman who stumbled in, clutching a battered shoebox that would change everything. Sarah Thompson's heart pounded in her chest as she sat rigid on the hard wooden bench of the defendant's box. The air in the Oakville County Courthouse felt thick and oppressive, weighted down by the gravity of what was about to unfold. She could feel the eyes of the spectators boring into her back, their whispers a constant hum of judgment. Her gaze remained fixed on her trembling hands, unable to meet the stern countenance of Judge Harrison as he prepared to deliver her fate. The past year had been a blur of fear, pain, and uncertainty, leading to this moment where her entire future hung in the balance. Emily Chen, Sarah's dedicated defense attorney, placed a reassuring hand on her client's arm. But even Emily's unwavering support couldn't quell the storm of emotions raging within Sarah. How had she ended up here, facing life in prison for defending herself against the man who had sworn to love and protect her? As Judge Harrison cleared his throat, preparing to speak, Sarah's mind raced through the events that had led to this point. The years of abuse at the hands of her husband, David. The isolation from friends and family. The constant fear that gripped her every waking moment. And finally, that fateful night when everything had come to a violent head. In the case of the state versus Sarah Thompson, Judge Harrison began, his voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. "I am prepared to render my verdict." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a resounding bang. All heads whipped around to see a petite, middle-aged woman stumbling into the room, her dark hair disheveled and her eyes wild with urgency. "Wait," she cried out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Please, Your Honor, you can't sentence her yet. I have evidence that will change everything." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as the woman hurried down the center aisle, clutching a battered shoebox to her chest as if it contained the most precious treasure in the world. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the woman. It was Jessica Walker, the housekeeper who had worked for her and David for years. Jessica had always been kind to Sarah, offering small comforts and concerned glances, but she had never spoken up about the abuse she must have witnessed. Judge Harrison's face clouded with annoyance at the interruption. "Madam, this is highly irregular. We are in the middle of..." "Please," Jessica interrupted, her eyes brimming with tears as she approached the bench. "I'm Jessica Walker. I worked for the Thompsons for over a decade. What's in this box will prove that Sarah is innocent, that she had no choice but to defend herself." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Jessica placed the shoebox on the evidence table. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope spark in her chest, fragile but persistent. Emily Chen jumped to her feet. "Your Honor, I move that we examine this new evidence immediately. It could be crucial to my client's case." The prosecutor, Richard Davis, scowled and rose to object. "Your Honor, this is completely out of order. The defense has rested its case, and we were about to hear the verdict. This 11th-hour stunt is clearly an attempt to..." "Mr. Davis," Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone sharp. "While I agree that the timing is highly unusual, I cannot in good conscience ignore potential evidence that may be relevant to this case." He turned his stern gaze to Jessica. "Mrs. Walker, you understand that interfering with court proceedings is a serious offense?" Jessica nodded vigorously, her hands shaking as she clutched the edge of the evidence table. "Yes, Your Honor. I know I should have come forward sooner, but I was scared. David Thompson. He threatened me, my family. But I can't let an innocent woman go to prison. Not when I have proof of what really happened in that house." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process what was happening. She had always suspected that Jessica knew more than she let on, but she never imagined the housekeeper would risk everything to come to her defense. A complex mixture of gratitude, fear, and hope swirled within her. Judge Harrison sighed heavily, the weight of his decision evident in the deep lines of his face. After a moment of contemplation, he nodded. "Very well, Mrs. Walker, please approach the bench with your evidence. Mr. Davis, Ms. Chen, you will both have the opportunity to examine whatever is in that box." As Jessica stepped forward, Sarah caught Emily's eye. Her lawyer's expression was a mixture of shock and cautious optimism. This unexpected turn of events could be the miracle they had been hoping for, or it could be another cruel twist in a case that had already taken so many unpredictable turns. The next few moments seemed to stretch into eternity as Jessica carefully opened the shoebox. Sarah couldn't see its contents from where she sat, but she watched as Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. The prosecutor's face reddened with anger, while Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Your Honor," Emily said, her voice tight with controlled excitement, "in light of this new evidence, I move for an immediate recess to allow both sides to examine these materials and potentially reopen the case." Judge Harrison nodded gravely. "Motion granted. This court will recess for 1 hour. Mrs. Walker, you will remain here to answer questions about this evidence. Bailiff, please ensure that all materials are properly documented and secured." As the gavel fell, signaling the recess, the courtroom erupted into a frenzy of whispers and movement. Sarah remained rooted to her seat, her mind struggling to process the sudden shift in her fortunes. For the first time in months, a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in her chest. Emily hurried over to her, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Sarah, I don't know exactly what's in that box yet, but from what I glimpsed, it could be game-changing. We might have a real shot at proving your innocence now." Sarah nodded numbly, her eyes fixed on Jessica, who was now surrounded by court officials. The housekeeper caught her gaze and offered a small, tremulous smile. In that moment, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. As she was led out of the courtroom by the bailiff, Sarah allowed herself to imagine, for the first time in months, a future where she might be free. But she also knew that the road ahead would be challenging. The truth that Jessica had brought into the light would force Sarah to confront the darkest chapters of her past, to relive the pain and fear she had endured for so long. Yet as the courtroom doors closed behind her, Sarah squared her shoulders and took a deep breath. Whatever came next, she would face it with the strength and resilience that had allowed her to survive this far. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the chance for justice and healing. The next hour would determine the course of her future, and Sarah Thompson was ready to fight for her freedom, her dignity, and the truth that had been hidden for far too long. As Sarah was escorted to a small conference room to wait out the recess, her mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions and memories. The sterile walls and humming fluorescent lights seemed to fade away as she found herself transported back to the beginning of her story, to the day she first met David Thompson. It had been a crisp autumn afternoon, leaves crunching underfoot as Sarah hurried across the Oakville Community College campus. She'd been running late for her literature class, arms laden with books, when she collided with a tall, handsome stranger. His warm smile and gentle hands as he helped her gather her scattered belongings had made her heart flutter. David had been charming, attentive, and so different from the abusive father Sarah had grown up with. He made her feel safe, cherished, and worthy of love. Their whirlwind romance had swept her off her feet, and within a year, they were married. The early days of their marriage had been blissful. David showered her with affection and encouragement as she pursued her teaching degree. They bought a quaint house on Maple Street, with a white picket fence and a garden that Sarah lovingly tended. From the outside, they appeared to be the perfect couple, living the American dream in small-town Oakville. But the facade had begun to crack almost imperceptibly at first. It started with small criticisms, the way she dressed, how she cooked his meals, her choice of friends. David's charming smile would twist into a sneer when they were alone, his words cutting deeper than any physical blow. Sarah's fingers unconsciously traced the faded scar on her wrist, a permanent reminder of the night everything had changed. It had been their third wedding anniversary. She'd prepared a special dinner, hoping to rekindle the warmth that had been slowly leaching from their relationship. But David had come home late, reeking of whiskey and rage. The sound of shattering glass still echoed in her nightmares, the wine bottle exploding against the wall mere inches from her head. That night, David's carefully constructed mask had slipped completely, revealing the monster that lurked beneath. Sarah had ended up in the emergency room, her wrist broken and her spirit crushed, reciting the lie that she had tripped on the stairs. From that moment on, life with David had become a precarious balancing act. Sarah walked on eggshells, constantly trying to anticipate his moods and avoid his wrath. She withdrew from friends and family, ashamed of the bruises she couldn't always hide and the lies she told to protect her abuser. Her only solace had been her job at Oakville High School, teaching English to bright-eyed teenagers who still believed in the power of words and the promise of a better future. In her classroom, Sarah could pretend that her life was normal, that she wasn't living in constant fear. It was during this time that Jessica Walker had entered their lives. The quiet, efficient housekeeper had quickly become a silent witness to the nightmare unfolding behind the Thompsons' perfectly manicured facade. Sarah often caught glimpses of concern and understanding in Jessica's eyes, but neither woman had ever broached the subject directly. Now, sitting in the sterile conference room, Sarah wondered what secrets Jessica had been harboring all these years. What evidence could she have gathered that might change the course of the trial? A soft knock on the door jolted Sarah from her reverie. Emily Chen entered, her usually composed features etched with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Sarah," Emily began, taking a seat across from her client, "I've had a chance to review some of the evidence Mrs. Walker brought in. It's substantial." Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What is it, Emily? What did Jessica have?" Emily took a deep breath. "Photos, Sarah, dozens of them, documenting your injuries over the years. There are also audio recordings. It seems Jessica had been secretly documenting the abuse for a long time." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. All those years, she had thought she was alone, suffering in silence. But Jessica had seen, had known, and had been gathering evidence. "There's more," Emily continued, her voice gentle but urgent. Jessica kept a detailed diary, noting dates and descriptions of the incidents she witnessed or overheard. She also saved some physical evidence, torn clothing, a blood-stained pillowcase. Items that corroborate your account of the abuse. A sob escaped Sarah's throat, years of pent-up emotion finally breaking free. The relief of being believed, of having concrete proof of her ordeal, was overwhelming. Emily reached across the table, grasping Sarah's trembling hands. "This changes everything, Sarah. With this evidence, we can prove a long-standing pattern of abuse. It supports your claim of self-defense on the night David died." As the implications of this new development sank in, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions washing over her. Relief warred with residual fear, hope battled with the ingrained habit of expecting the worst. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily's expression turned determined. "Now, we fight. The prosecution will try to discredit this new evidence, but its sheer volume and detail will be hard to dismiss. We're going to petition the judge to allow us to reopen the defense in light of this new information." Sarah nodded, drawing strength from her lawyer's confidence. For the first time since that fateful night, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the walls of a prison cell. As Emily outlined their strategy for the coming hours, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the night that had brought her to this moment. The night she had finally fought back. It had been a typical evening of tension and fear in the Thompson household. David had been drinking heavily, his mood darkening with each empty bottle. Sarah had retreated to the kitchen, busying herself with dinner preparations, hoping to avoid his volatile temper. But there had been no avoiding him that night. David had stormed into the kitchen, raging about some perceived slight. Before Sarah could react, he had grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against the refrigerator. As black spots danced at the edges of her vision, Sarah's hand had closed around the handle of a kitchen knife. What followed was a blur of desperation and instinct. Sarah had lashed out, feeling the knife connect with solid flesh. David's grip had loosened, surprise replacing rage in his eyes. He had staggered back, blood blossoming across his shirt, before collapsing to the floor. Sarah had stood frozen, the bloodied knife slipping from her numb fingers. In that moment, as she watched the life drain from her abuser's eyes, she had felt not triumph or relief, but a profound, aching sadness for the love that had twisted into something so dark and destructive. The ensuing hours were a chaotic swirl of flashing lights, police questions, and dawning horror as Sarah realized that her nightmare was far from over. Without visible bruises or a documented history of abuse, her claims of self-defense had been met with skepticism by the authorities. Now, with Jessica's evidence, there was a chance for the truth to finally come to light. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. She had survived years of abuse. She could survive this trial and whatever came after. As Emily concluded her briefing, a court officer appeared at the door, informing them that the recess was ending. It was time to return to the courtroom and face whatever fate awaited. Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. As she followed Emily out of the conference room, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a window. The woman staring back at her was battered and weary, but there was a glimmer of strength in her eyes that had been missing for far too long. Whatever the outcome, Sarah knew that by standing up for herself, both on that fateful night and now in this courtroom, she had already taken the first steps towards reclaiming her life and her dignity. With her head held high, Sarah Thompson walked back into the courtroom, ready to face the truth, the jury, and the chance at a future free from fear. As Sarah re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. The air crackled with tension and anticipation. Judge Harrison's face was a mask of stern professionalism, but Sarah could detect a hint of weariness around his eyes. The weight of the unexpected turn of events seemed to press down on everyone present. Sarah's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the spectators. Some looked at her with newfound sympathy, while others appeared confused or skeptical. Her eyes landed on Jessica Walker, who sat rigidly in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The housekeeper offered Sarah a small, encouraging nod. As Sarah took her seat at the defense table, she noticed Richard Davis, the prosecutor, in an intense whispered conversation with his team. His face was flushed, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead. The sudden introduction of new evidence had clearly thrown him off balance. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a sharp crack, silencing the murmurs that filled the courtroom. "This court is now back in session," he announced, his voice commanding attention. "In light of the new evidence presented by Mrs. Jessica Walker, I have decided to allow both the prosecution and the defense to re-examine their cases." He turned his stern gaze to Emily Chen. "Ms. Chen, as the defense counsel, you may present this new evidence and call any additional witnesses you deem necessary." Emily stood, her posture radiating confidence. "Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Jessica Walker to the stand." A ripple of anticipation ran through the courtroom as Jessica made her way to the witness stand. Sarah watched as the woman who had been a quiet presence in her life for so many years raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. Emily approached the stand, her voice clear and steady. "Mrs. Walker, can you please tell the court about your employment with the Thompson family?" Jessica's voice trembled slightly as she began. "I worked as a housekeeper for David and Sarah Thompson for 11 years. I was there 3 times a week, cleaning the house and sometimes helping with laundry or meal preparation." "And during your time working for the Thompsons, did you witness any incidents of abuse?" Emily asked. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I did, many times." As Jessica recounted incident after incident, Sarah found herself transported back to those terrible moments. The sound of flesh striking flesh, the crash of thrown objects, her own muffled sobs, it all came rushing back with vivid clarity. "Why didn't you report what you saw?" Emily's question cut through Sarah's painful reverie. Jessica's shoulders sagged. "I was afraid. David, he threatened me. Said he'd make sure I'd never work again if I told anyone. And I have 2 kids in college. I couldn't risk losing my job." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "But I couldn't just do nothing. So I started keeping records, gathering evidence. I thought maybe someday Sarah would be ready to leave, and she'd need proof of what happened to her." As Emily continued her questioning, guiding Jessica through the evidence she had collected over the years, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions churning within her. Gratitude for Jessica's silent vigilance warred with a deep sadness that she hadn't felt able to reach out for help sooner. The photographs were the hardest to face. As they were displayed on a large screen for the court to see, Sarah heard gasps and murmurs from the spectators. Images of her battered face, arms mottled with bruises, and the haunted look in her eyes told a story more powerful than words ever could. When it came time for cross-examination, Richard Davis approached the stand with the air of a man treading on thin ice. His usual aggressive style was tempered, perhaps by the damning nature of the evidence or the sympathetic shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. "Mrs. Walker," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "you claim to have witnessed numerous incidents of abuse over the years. Why did you wait until now, when Mrs. Thompson is on trial for killing her husband, to come forward with this evidence?" Jessica's chin lifted defiantly. "Because I was a coward," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I was afraid of losing my job, of what David might do. But when I heard that Sarah might go to prison for defending herself, I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent any longer." Davis pressed on, trying to find inconsistencies in Jessica's testimony, but the housekeeper's account remained steady. With each question, the prosecutor seemed to lose more ground. As the cross-examination concluded, Sarah caught Emily's eye. Her lawyer's expression was one of cautious optimism. This testimony, combined with the physical evidence Jessica had provided, was painting a vivid picture of the years of abuse Sarah had endured. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tension. "We'll take a 15-minute recess. When we return, the defense may call its next witness." As the courtroom began to empty, Sarah remained seated, feeling drained yet oddly energized. The truth of her life with David was finally being exposed to the light of day. It was painful, raw, and deeply personal, but it was also liberating. Emily leaned in close, her voice low and urgent. "Sarah, I think we should put you on the stand next." With the groundwork laid by Jessica's testimony and evidence, your account of that final night will carry even more weight. Sarah nodded, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The thought of recounting that terrible night in front of the entire courtroom was daunting, but she knew it was necessary. It was time for her to reclaim her voice and tell her story. As she steeled herself for what was to come, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the women she had encountered in the support group she'd reluctantly attended while awaiting trial. Women who, like her, had lived in the shadow of abuse, their spirits dimmed by fear and shame. She thought of their courage, their resilience, and the way they had embraced her without judgment. In that moment, Sarah realized that her testimony wouldn't just be for herself. It would be for all those women, those she had met and the countless others she would never know. By speaking her truth, she might give courage to others trapped in the cycle of abuse. The bailiff's voice announced the end of the recess, and Sarah rose, her resolve strengthening with each step back to the courtroom. As she took her seat once more, she caught sight of a familiar face in the back of the room, her younger sister, Amy, whom she hadn't spoken to in years. Amy's presence was unexpected, a poignant reminder of all the relationships that had been strained or broken during her years with David. Their eyes met, and Amy gave a small, encouraging smile. In that silent exchange, Sarah felt a surge of support that fortified her for the challenge ahead. As Judge Harrison called the court back to order, Sarah took a deep breath. The next few hours would be grueling, forcing her to relive the darkest moments of her life. But for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility of freedom, not just from the threat of prison, but from the prison of fear and shame she had lived in for so long. Emily stood, her voice ringing clear in the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, the defense calls Sarah Thompson to the stand." As Sarah rose to take the oath, she felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her. This was her moment to speak her truth, to give voice to years of silent suffering. With one last deep breath, she stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. As Sarah took her place on the witness stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her, but beneath the nervousness, a steady resolve had taken root. This was her chance to tell her story, to give voice to the years of silent suffering. Emily Chen approached, her demeanor calm and reassuring. "Mrs. Thompson," she began, "can you please tell the court about your relationship with your late husband, David?" Sarah took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. "When I first met David, he was charming, attentive, everything I thought I wanted in a partner. We got married quickly, and at first, everything seemed perfect." As Sarah spoke, her voice grew stronger. She recounted the early days of their marriage, the subtle shifts in David's behavior, and the gradual erosion of her sense of self. The courtroom listened in rapt attention as she described the first time David had struck her, the shock and disbelief she had felt, and the apologies and promises that had followed. But it didn't stop, Sarah continued, her voice catching slightly. It got worse. The violence became more frequent, more severe. He would apologize, swear it would never happen again, but it always did. Emily guided Sarah through her testimony with careful questions, helping her paint a vivid picture of life with David. Sarah described the isolation, the constant fear, and the elaborate web of lies she had woven to hide the truth from the outside world. "Why didn't you leave?" Emily asked, her tone gentle but probing. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid. David had threatened to kill me if I ever tried to leave. And I was ashamed. I thought it was my fault, that if I could just be better, do better, he would stop." She paused, taking a shaky breath. And part of me still loved the man I thought he was when we first met. I kept hoping he would change back into that person. As Sarah's testimony continued, she could see the impact her words were having on the jury. Some looked horrified, others wiped away tears. Even Richard Davis, the prosecutor who had been so determined to paint her as a cold-blooded killer, seemed shaken. Finally, Emily came to the night of David's death. "Mrs. Thompson, can you tell us what happened on the evening of May 15th? Sarah closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself. When she opened them, her gaze was steady. David had been drinking heavily that day. He was in one of his moods. I could tell it was going to be bad. I tried to stay out of his way, but he followed me into the kitchen." Her voice faltered as she recounted the violent confrontation, David's hands around her throat, the desperate struggle for breath. "I thought I was going to die," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My hand found the knife on the counter. I didn't think, I just reacted." As Sarah described the moment the knife plunged into David's chest, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see them covered in blood again. "I didn't want to kill him," she said softly. "I just wanted the pain to stop." Emily nodded sympathetically. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. No further questions, Your Honor." As Emily returned to her seat, Sarah braced herself for the cross-examination. Richard Davis approached the stand, his earlier confidence somewhat diminished. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his tone carefully controlled, "you've painted a picture of years of abuse at the hands of your husband. Yet, prior to the night of his death, you never filed a police report or sought medical attention for your injuries. Can you explain why?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I was terrified. David had connections in the local police department. He played golf with the chief every Sunday. He told me that if I ever went to the cops, he'd make sure I regretted it. And as for medical attention, well, you heard Mrs. Walker's testimony. David was careful not to leave marks where people could see them most of the time." Davis pressed on, trying to find inconsistencies in Sarah's story, but she remained composed. With each question, she felt stronger, more certain of her truth. As the cross-examination concluded, Judge Harrison addressed Sarah. "Mrs. Thompson, you may step down." Sarah returned to her seat beside Emily, feeling drained but oddly liberated. For years, she had carried the weight of her secret, the shame and fear that had become her constant companions. Now, having spoken her truth in front of the court, she felt as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The rest of the day passed in a blur of expert testimonies and legal arguments. A domestic violence expert took the stand, explaining the psychology of abuse and the reasons why victims often stay with their abusers. The medical examiner who had performed David's autopsy was recalled, this time to comment on the defensive nature of Sarah's actions based on the new evidence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courtroom windows, Judge Harrison called an end to the day's proceedings. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments," he announced. Court is adjourned. The courtroom buzzed with conversation as people began to file out. Sarah remained seated, feeling both exhausted and wired. Emily leaned in close, her voice low and encouraging. "You did wonderfully, Sarah. Your testimony was powerful and genuine. I think we've given the jury a lot to think about." As they gathered their things to leave, Sarah noticed her sister Amy hovering uncertainly nearby. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah approached her. "Amy," she said softly, "I'm glad you came." Amy's eyes filled with tears as she pulled Sarah into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea. I should have known, should have done something." Sarah returned the hug, feeling a rush of emotion. "It's not your fault," she assured her sister. "I didn't let anyone know. I couldn't." As they pulled apart, Amy wiped her eyes. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know I'm here for you. We'll get through this together." Sarah nodded, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. As Sarah left the courthouse, stepping into the cool evening air, she felt a mix of exhaustion and cautious hope. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments and then the agonizing wait for the jury's decision. But regardless of the outcome, she had reclaimed her voice and her truth. She had taken the first step towards healing and freedom. The stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky as Sarah made her way home. Tomorrow would be another battle, but tonight, she would rest, gathering her strength for whatever lay ahead. For the first time in years, Sarah Thompson allowed herself to imagine a future free from fear, a future where she could begin to rebuild her life on her own terms. As dawn broke over Oakville, Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching the sky transition from inky black to soft pinks and golds. She hadn't slept much, her mind replaying yesterday's testimony and anxiously anticipating the day ahead. The coffee maker gurgled softly behind her, its familiar aroma a small comfort in the face of the momentous day ahead. A gentle knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Sarah opened it to find Emily standing there, looking fresh and determined despite the early hour. "I thought you might want some company this morning," Emily said with a warm smile. "And maybe a quick review before we head to the courthouse." Sarah nodded gratefully, ushering her lawyer inside. As they sat at the kitchen table, mugs of steaming coffee between them, Emily outlined what to expect from the day's proceedings. "The prosecution will give their closing arguments first," Emily explained. "Davis will try to paint you as a calculating murderer who took advantage of a drunken argument to kill your husband. He'll likely downplay the evidence of abuse, suggesting it doesn't justify your actions." Sarah's hands tightened around her mug, but she nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. Emily continued, her voice steady and reassuring. "Then it'll be our turn. I'm going to walk the jury through the years of abuse you suffered, emphasizing how the system failed you at every turn. We'll reinforce the idea that your actions were a desperate act of self-defense, not premeditated murder." As Emily spoke, Sarah found herself transported back to the countless times she had tried to seek help, only to be met with disbelief or indifference. The police officer who had suggested she must have done something to provoke David. The emergency room doctor who had accepted her flimsy explanation of falling down the stairs without question. The well-meaning but clueless friends who had advised her to try harder to make her marriage work. "Sarah?" Emily's gentle voice brought her back to the present. "Are you okay?" Sarah blinked back tears she hadn't realized were forming. "Yes, I'm fine. It's just, hearing it all laid out like this, it's overwhelming. For so long, I thought I was alone, that no one would believe me." Emily reached across the table, squeezing Sarah's hand. "You're not alone anymore. And after yesterday's testimony, I believe the jury sees the truth of what you've been through." As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, still weary and marked by her experiences, but with a spark of determination in her eyes that had long been absent. The drive to the courthouse was quiet, each woman lost in her own thoughts. As they approached the imposing building, Sarah noticed a small group gathered on the steps. Her heart leapt as she recognized faces from her support group, women who had shared their own stories of survival and offered her understanding when she felt most alone. One of them, a petite woman named Maria, stepped forward as Sarah approached. "We wanted to be here for you," she said softly, "to show you that you're not alone." Overwhelmed by the gesture, Sarah could only nod, tears pricking at her eyes. As she climbed the courthouse steps, surrounded by this impromptu circle of support, she felt a surge of strength. Whatever happened inside, she would face it knowing that there were people who believed in her, who understood her truth. The courtroom was already buzzing with tension when Sarah and Emily entered. As they took their seats at the defense table, Sarah's eyes swept the room. She saw Jessica Walker sitting rigidly in the front row, her face a mask of nervous anticipation. Her sister Amy was there too, offering a small, encouraging smile. And in the back, trying to blend into the crowd, she spotted her former neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, the woman who had always turned up her music when the sounds of violence echoed from the Thompson house. Judge Harrison entered, his presence immediately commanding silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice grave, "we will now hear closing arguments in the case of the state versus Sarah Thompson. Mr. Davis, you may proceed." Richard Davis rose, straightening his tie as he approached the jury. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and persuasive. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the past days, you have heard a tale of alleged abuse and fear. The defense would have you believe that Sarah Thompson had no choice but to kill her husband in self-defense." He paced slowly before the jury box, his words carefully chosen. "But let us not forget the facts. On the night of May 15th, Sarah Thompson plunged a kitchen knife into her husband's chest, ending his life. This was not a split-second reaction to imminent danger, but a deliberate act. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap as Davis continued, questioning the reliability of Jessica's evidence, suggesting that if the abuse had been as severe as claimed, surely someone would have noticed sooner. He painted David as a flawed but essentially decent man, and Sarah as a woman who had chosen murder over divorce. "The law is clear," Davis concluded, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "Domestic issues, no matter how severe, do not give one the right to take a life." Sarah Thompson had options. She could have left, she could have sought help. Instead, she chose to become judge, jury, and executioner. Don't let emotions cloud your judgment. The facts are clear. Sarah Thompson is guilty of murder. As Davis returned to his seat, Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. His words, so confidently delivered, seemed to erase all the progress they had made. She glanced at Emily, seeking reassurance, and found her lawyer already on her feet, ready to present their closing argument. Emily's approach was different from Davis's polished performance. She stood close to the jury, her voice low and intense. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard Mr. Davis talk about facts. But let me remind you of some facts he conveniently overlooked." She proceeded to walk the jury through the years of abuse Sarah had endured, using the photos and records provided by Jessica to paint a vivid picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare. "Sarah Thompson didn't choose to become judge, jury, and executioner," Emily said, her voice filled with controlled passion. "She was fighting for her life. After years of abuse, years of being failed by every system meant to protect her, Sarah faced a terrible choice: her life or her abusers." Emily's words seemed to captivate the jury, their eyes fixed on her as she spoke. She reminded them of the expert testimony about the psychology of abuse, the reasons why women stay, the constant state of fear and hypervigilance that becomes normal in an abusive relationship. "Ask yourselves," Emily continued, her voice softening, "what would you do if you believed, truly believed, that this was your last chance to survive? If you knew that no one was coming to save you, that the system had failed you time and time again?" As Emily's closing argument neared its end, Sarah found herself holding her breath, caught up in the power of her lawyer's words. "Sarah Thompson is not a murderer," Emily concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. "She is a survivor, a woman who endured years of abuse and terror, and who, when pushed to the absolute limit, chose to live. Don't punish her for that choice. Don't fail her as so many others have. Find her not guilty, and let her begin to heal." As Emily returned to her seat, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Sarah could feel the weight of the jury's gaze, could see them processing everything they had heard. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the evidence and arguments from both sides. It is now your responsibility to deliberate and reach a verdict. Remember, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. If you have any reasonable doubt about the defendant's guilt, you must find her not guilty." As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, Sarah felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. Everything now rested in the hands of 12 strangers. Would they see her truth? Would they understand the impossible choice she had faced? All she could do now was wait, and hope that finally, after all these years, justice would be on her side. As the courtroom emptied, a palpable tension lingered in the air. Sarah remained seated at the defense table, her mind racing with a mix of hope and fear. Emily placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did well, Sarah," she said softly. "Now we wait." The next few hours stretched into an eternity. Sarah paced the corridor outside the courtroom, her sister Amy by her side. They spoke little, both lost in their own thoughts. Occasionally, Sarah would catch glimpses of the jurors being escorted to and from the deliberation room, their faces unreadable masks of concentration. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself drawn to a quiet corner of the courthouse. She sat on a hard wooden bench, closing her eyes and allowing her mind to wander. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond this trial. What would freedom look like? The concept seemed almost foreign after so many years of living in fear. She thought about her students at Oakville High, wondering if she'd ever be able to return to teaching. She thought about the small garden she'd once lovingly tended, now overgrown and neglected. She thought about relationships, with her sister, with friends she'd pushed away, with the possibility of trust and love that didn't come with pain. A soft voice interrupted her reverie. "Mrs. Thompson? Sarah opened her eyes to find Jessica Walker standing before her, wringing her hands nervously. I wanted to apologize, Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have come forward sooner. Maybe if I had. Sarah shook her head, gesturing for Jessica to sit beside her. You have nothing to apologize for, Jessica. You risked so much to help me. Without your evidence, I don't know where I'd be. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. I was so scared, she admitted. Every time I saw what he did to you, I wanted to say something, do something. But I kept thinking about my own kids, about losing my job. Sarah reached out, taking Jessica's hand in her own. I understand. Believe me, I understand fear. You did what you could. You gathered evidence, you kept records. And when it mattered most, you found the courage to come forward. That means everything. The two women sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jessica spoke again, her voice stronger. Whatever happens, Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that I believe you. And I'm sorry I didn't help you sooner. As Jessica stood to leave, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. In the midst of this nightmare, she had found unexpected allies, people willing to stand up and speak the truth. It didn't erase the years of pain and isolation, but it offered a glimmer of hope for the future. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. Sarah looked up to see Emily approaching, her expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. The jury's back, Emily said, slightly out of breath. They've reached a verdict. Sarah's heart began to race as she followed Emily back to the courtroom. The room filled quickly, an air of anticipation hanging heavy over the assembled crowd. As Sarah took her seat at the defense table, she caught sight of her sister slipping into a seat in the back, offering a small, encouraging smile. Judge Harrison entered, his face as inscrutable as ever. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the jury has reached a verdict. Is this correct? The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stood. Yes, Your Honor. Very well. Will the defendant please rise? Sarah stood on shaky legs, Emily's steadying hand on her elbow. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the foreman unfolded a small piece of paper. In the case of the state versus Sarah Thompson, on the charge of second-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant. Sarah closed her eyes, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Not guilty. The words hung in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of reactions. Sarah stood frozen, unable to process what she just heard. Not guilty. She was free. Emily's arms were around her in an instant, tears of joy and relief streaming down both their faces. From somewhere behind her, Sarah could hear her sister's elated cry. The jurors were being thanked and dismissed, spectators were talking excitedly, but it all faded into background noise as the reality of the verdict sank in. Judge Harrison's gavel cut through the commotion. Order in the court, he called, his voice firm but not unkind. As the room quieted, he turned his attention to Sarah. Mrs. Thompson, you have been found not guilty by a jury of your peers. You are free to go. This court is adjourned. With another bang of the gavel, it was over. The nightmare that had consumed Sarah's life for so long had finally come to an end. As Sarah made her way out of the courtroom, she was engulfed in a sea of well-wishers. Her sister Amy hugged her tightly, whispering words of love and support. Members of her support group surrounded her, their faces shining with tears and smiles. Even some of the jurors nodded in her direction, their eyes conveying understanding and compassion. Outside the courthouse, a small group of reporters had gathered. Sarah hesitated, overwhelmed by the thought of facing more questions, more scrutiny. But Emily gently urged her forward. You don't have to say much, she advised. But this is your chance to control the narrative, to help others who might be in the same situation. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped up to the microphones. The questions came rapid fire, but she focused on delivering the message she felt was most important. To anyone out there who's living in fear, who's suffering abuse in silence, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word, please know that you're not alone. There is help available. There is hope. Don't give up. As the impromptu press conference wound down, Sarah felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Maria, one of the women from her support group, standing there with tears in her eyes. Thank you, Maria said softly. Your story, your courage, it's given me the strength to leave my own abusive situation. You've saved more than just yourself today." Sarah pulled Maria into a tight hug, her own eyes welling with tears. In that moment, she realized that her journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. She had survived, yes, but now she had the opportunity to thrive, to help others, to be a voice for those still trapped in the cycle of abuse. As the sun began to set over Oakville, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Sarah took a moment to herself. She closed her eyes, feeling the warm breeze on her face, listening to the sounds of life going on around her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to take a deep, unrestricted breath. She was free. Free from David's tyranny, free from the fear that had been her constant companion, free from the burden of silence and shame. The road ahead would not be easy. She knew there would be challenges, setbacks, days when the trauma of her past would threaten to overwhelm her. But she also knew that she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. As she opened her eyes, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a nearby window. The woman looking back at her was battered and weary, yes, but there was a light in her eyes that had been absent for far too long. It was the light of hope, of possibility, of a future reclaimed. With a small smile, Sarah Thompson took her first steps into that future, ready to face whatever it might bring. She was a survivor, a warrior, and now, finally, she was free. As Sarah stepped away from the courthouse, the weight of years seemed to lift from her shoulders. The future, once a dark and terrifying prospect, now stretched before her like an open road, full of possibility and hope. But with that hope came a new kind of uncertainty. After so long living in survival mode, Sarah found herself unsure of how to navigate this newfound freedom. Emily caught up with her at the bottom of the courthouse steps, her face flushed with the excitement of their victory. "Sarah," she said, her voice filled with warmth, "I know this is overwhelming. Why don't you come stay at my place tonight? We can figure out next steps tomorrow." Sarah nodded gratefully, realizing she hadn't given much thought to where she would go. The house she had shared with David held too many painful memories to return to, at least not yet. As they drove through the familiar streets of Oakville, Sarah found herself seeing the town with new eyes. The local diner where she and David had their first date now seemed like a relic from another life. The park where she used to walk, always looking over her shoulder, now held the promise of peaceful afternoons. Emily's apartment was small but cozy, filled with books and colorful artwork. As Sarah sank into the comfortable couch, the events of the day finally caught up with her. Exhaustion washed over her in waves, and before she knew it, she had drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of voices. She found Emily in the kitchen, speaking quietly on the phone. As Sarah entered, Emily wrapped up her call and turned with a smile. "How are you feeling?" she asked, pouring a steaming mug of coffee and sliding it across the counter. Sarah considered the question, realizing it was the first time in years she'd been asked that without immediately crafting a lie in response. "Overwhelmed," she admitted, "relieved, scared, hopeful, it's all mixed up." Emily nodded understandingly. "That's completely normal. You've been through a tremendous ordeal, and now you're facing a major life transition. It's okay to feel uncertain." As they sipped their coffee, Emily outlined some immediate practical concerns. "I've been in touch with a victims advocacy group," she explained. "They can help with temporary housing, counseling, job placement, whatever you need to get back on your feet." The mention of job placement sent a pang through Sarah's heart. "Do you think I'll ever be able to teach again?" she asked softly. Emily's expression was sympathetic but determined. "It might take some time, but yes, I believe you will. Your case has garnered a lot of public support. People understand that you were a victim, not a criminal. In fact," she paused, a small smile playing at her lips, "I've already received calls from several organizations interested in having you speak about your experiences." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. The thought of sharing her story publicly was both terrifying and oddly appealing. If her experiences could help others, maybe some good could come from all the pain she'd endured. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself swept up in a whirlwind of activity. She met with a counselor who specialized in helping survivors of domestic abuse, began the process of finding a new place to live, and even gave a brief interview to a local newspaper, sharing her story in hopes of reaching others who might be suffering in silence. Throughout it all, Sarah was struck by the outpouring of support from unexpected quarters. Former colleagues from the high school sent messages of encouragement. Students she had taught years ago reached out on social media, sharing how much her kindness had meant to them. Even Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who had turned a blind eye for so long, stopped by Emily's apartment with a casserole and tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Callahan said, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have done something. I should have helped." Sarah, touched by the gesture, found herself comforting the older woman. "We all did what we thought we had to do to survive," she said gently. "The important thing is that we learn from this, that we do better in the future." As evening fell, Sarah found herself alone for the first time since the verdict. Emily had gone to meet with another client, leaving Sarah with a stack of self-help books and the number for a 24-hour support hotline, just in case. Curled up on the couch, Sarah allowed her mind to wander. She thought about David, not the monster he had become, but the man she had fallen in love with. She mourned for the life they could have had, for the dreams that had turned to ashes. But alongside that grief, she felt a growing sense of possibility. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "Thinking of you, sis. So proud of your strength. Let's have lunch tomorrow?" Sarah smiled, typing back a quick affirmative. The relationship with her sister, strained for so long by the secrets Sarah had kept, was slowly healing. It was just one of many relationships she hoped to rebuild or rediscover in this new chapter of her life. As she settled in for the night, Sarah's gaze fell on her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her was changed, marked by her experiences but not defined by them. She saw strength in the set of her jaw, hope in the clarity of her eyes. For the first time in years, she saw a future worth fighting for. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Sarah found a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a cozy space that felt like a fresh start. She began attending regular therapy sessions, slowly unpacking years of trauma and learning coping mechanisms for the nightmares and anxiety that still plagued her. She also started volunteering at a local women's shelter, sharing her story with others who were still trapped in the cycle of abuse. It was difficult, often heartbreaking work, but Sarah found it immensely fulfilling. Each time she saw a glimmer of hope in a woman's eyes, each time someone found the courage to leave an abusive situation, she felt a little more of her own pain transmute into purpose. One sunny afternoon, about a month after the trial, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Detective Mark Rodriguez, the officer who had initially investigated David's death, stood awkwardly at her door. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice gruff but kind, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your case, about you, that were unfair and unprofessional. I'm sorry I didn't dig deeper, didn't see the signs." Sarah invited him in, touched by his sincerity. Over coffee, they had a long, honest conversation about the challenges of identifying and addressing domestic abuse, especially in small communities where everyone thinks they know their neighbors. As Detective Rodriguez was leaving, he paused in the doorway. "We're implementing new training programs for officers," he said, "focusing on recognizing signs of abuse, understanding victim psychology. Would you consider coming to speak to our department sometime? I think your perspective could really make a difference." Sarah agreed without hesitation, recognizing another opportunity to turn her pain into positive change. As summer turned to fall, Sarah found herself settling into a new rhythm of life. She had started writing, pouring her experiences into a memoir that she hoped would reach others who felt trapped and alone. Her relationship with Amy had deepened, the sisters making up for lost time with long talks and shared laughter. There were still hard days, of course. Days when the memories overwhelmed her, when the sound of a slamming door made her jump, when she caught herself looking over her shoulder out of habit. But those days became fewer and farther between as time passed. One crisp October morning, Sarah stood before a mirror, preparing for a speaking engagement at a domestic violence awareness conference. As she smoothed her blouse and took a deep breath, she realized how far she had come from that terrified woman who had stood in a courtroom, her fate hanging in the balance. She was Sarah Thompson, survivor, advocate, and now, a beacon of hope for others. As she stepped out into the autumn sunshine, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead was still long, still challenging, but she was ready to face it. One day at a time, one step at a time, she was reclaiming her life and helping others do the same. And in that moment, Sarah knew with unshakable certainty that she was not just surviving anymore. She was thriving. As Sarah took her place at the podium, facing a sea of expectant faces at the Domestic Violence Awareness Conference, she felt a momentary flutter of nervousness. But as she began to speak, her voice grew stronger, fueled by the power of her story and her desire to make a difference. "My name is Sarah Thompson," she began, her voice clear and steady. "A year ago, I was trapped in an abusive marriage, living each day in fear. Today, I stand before you as a survivor, an advocate, and a woman reclaiming her power." As Sarah shared her story, she saw recognition and understanding in the eyes of many in the audience. She spoke of the subtle ways abuse can begin, the gradual erosion of self-esteem, the isolation from friends and family. She described the cycle of violence and reconciliation that had kept her trapped for so long, and the moment she finally found the strength to fight back. "But my story doesn't end with my escape," Sarah continued, her voice growing passionate. "It doesn't end with the trial or the verdict. My story, our story, is about what comes after. It's about healing, about rebuilding, about turning pain into purpose." As she concluded her speech, the room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, many with tears in their eyes. Sarah felt a surge of emotion, realizing that her words had touched something deep within these strangers. After the conference, Sarah found herself surrounded by people wanting to share their own stories or express their gratitude. One woman, her hands shaking slightly, approached Sarah with determination in her eyes. "I've been planning to leave my husband for months," she confided in a low voice. "But I've been so scared. Hearing your story, it's given me the courage to finally do it." "Thank you." Sarah hugged the woman tightly, whispering words of encouragement and slipping her the number of a local support group. As she watched the woman walk away, standing a little taller, Sarah felt a profound sense of purpose. This was why she had survived, why she continued to share her painful past, to light the way for others still trapped in the darkness. As the conference wound down, Sarah found herself deep in conversation with a group of lawmakers and advocates. They were discussing potential changes to domestic violence laws, ways to provide better support for victims, and strategies for prevention and education. "Mrs. Thompson," one of the lawmakers said, leaning in earnestly, "your perspective on this is invaluable. Would you consider joining our task force on domestic violence prevention? We need voices like yours to shape policy and drive real change." Sarah was stunned by the offer. She had never imagined that her experiences could influence legislation, that she could have a hand in shaping the very systems that had once failed her. With a mix of humility and determination, she accepted the position. As she drove home that evening, Sarah's mind was abuzz with possibilities. She thought about all the women and men still trapped in abusive situations, about the children growing up in homes filled with fear and violence. She thought about the complex web of societal, economic, and cultural factors that contributed to the cycle of abuse. And she thought about the changes she wanted to see in law enforcement, in the court system, in education, in community support networks. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah threw herself into her new role on the task force, bringing her unique perspective to discussions on everything from restraining order procedures to school-based prevention programs. She continued to speak at events and conferences, her story touching lives and inspiring change across the state. Her writing, too, took on new urgency. What had started as a personal memoir evolved into a powerful call to action, weaving her own experiences with broader insights into the nature of domestic violence and the societal changes needed to combat it. As her public profile grew, Sarah received invitations to appear on national talk shows and news programs. At first, the idea terrified her. The thought of sharing her story with millions of viewers made her stomach churn. But with encouragement from Emily, Amy, and her support network, Sarah decided to take the plunge. Her first national television appearance was on a popular morning show. As the makeup artist touched up her face and the producer clipped a microphone to her blouse, Sarah took deep, calming breaths. She reminded herself why she was doing this, not for fame or attention, but for every person out there who felt trapped and alone, as she once had. As the interview began, Sarah's initial nervousness melted away. The host was kind and empathetic, asking thoughtful questions that allowed Sarah to share her story in a meaningful way. When the conversation turned to her current advocacy work, Sarah felt a surge of passion. "We need to change the way we talk about domestic violence," she said, her voice firm and clear. "It's not a private family matter. It's a societal issue that affects all of us. We need better education, stronger support systems, and laws that truly protect victims. But most of all, we need to break the silence. We need to create a world where survivors feel safe coming forward, where they know they'll be believed and supported." As the segment ended, Sarah was flooded with messages of support. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories, inspired by her courage. News outlets picked up the interview, amplifying her message even further. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's life took on a new intensity. She was invited to speak at universities, law enforcement academies, and even international conferences. Her book, now complete, was picked up by a major publisher and was set to be released in the coming months. But even as her public life flourished, Sarah remained committed to her personal journey of healing. She continued her therapy sessions, learning to manage the occasional flashbacks and anxiety that still surfaced. She cultivated new friendships and deepened her relationship with Amy, creating a support network that helped her navigate the challenges of her new life. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah was preparing for a speaking engagement at her old high school, she received an unexpected call. It was from Maria, the woman from her support group who had found the courage to leave her own abusive situation after Sarah's trial. "Sarah," Maria's voice was filled with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you again. It's been a year since I left, and I'm happy, really happy. I've got a new job, I'm back in school, and I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. I don't know if I would have had the strength to do it without your example." As Sarah hung up the phone, tears of joy and gratitude streaming down her face, she was struck by the profound interconnectedness of their journeys. Her pain had given Maria courage. Maria's success now gave Sarah renewed purpose. Standing before the mirror, preparing to face a room full of teenagers, some of whom might be silently suffering as she once had, Sarah took a moment to reflect on the woman she had become. She saw strength in the set of her shoulders, compassion in the lines around her eyes, and an unwavering determination in her gaze. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do with her experiences. She was a survivor, yes, but more than that, she was a warrior for change, a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope in the darkness. As she stepped out of her house, the warm sun on her face and a sense of purpose in her heart, Sarah Thompson knew that while her journey was far from over, she was exactly where she needed to be. Every day was a new opportunity to make a difference, to turn her pain into purpose, and to help create a world where no one had to suffer in silence as she once had. With a deep breath and a confident stride, Sarah set out to face the day, ready to share her story once more and to light the way for others to find their own path to freedom and healing. As Sarah stood before the assembly of high school students, she was struck by a powerful sense of déjà vu. The same auditorium where she had once attended pep rallies and award ceremonies now held a sea of young faces, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I once sat where you're sitting now," Sarah began, her voice steady and warm. "I had dreams, hopes, and fears, just like each of you. But there was something else I carried with me every day, a secret that weighed me down and shaped every aspect of my life." As Sarah shared her story, tailored for her young audience, she watched their reactions carefully. Some looked shocked, others nodded in recognition, and a few wiped away tears. She spoke about the early warning signs of abusive relationships, the importance of self-worth, and the courage it takes to seek help. "Your voice matters," Sarah emphasized, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Whether it's your own story or a friend's, speaking up can be the first step towards change. Remember, you are not alone, and there is always hope." After her speech, a line of students formed, each waiting to speak with Sarah. Some shared their own experiences of family violence. Others asked how they could help friends they suspected were in abusive relationships. Sarah listened to each of them, offering words of encouragement and resources for help. As the last student walked away, Sarah noticed a familiar face approaching. It was Mr. Jenkins, her old English teacher, now gray-haired but with the same kind eyes she remembered. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't help but think. I should have noticed, should have done something." Sarah placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Mr. Jenkins, you were one of the few bright spots in my life back then. Your classroom was a safe haven. You did more than you know." As they talked, Sarah realized how much her old teacher had influenced her own teaching style in the years before her life had unraveled. His compassion, his ability to make each student feel seen and valued, these were qualities she had tried to emulate. The conversation with Mr. Jenkins sparked an idea in Sarah's mind. As she drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she could do in the realm of education. Prevention, she realized, was just as important as intervention and support for survivors. Over the next few weeks, Sarah threw herself into research, consulting with educators, counselors, and child psychologists. She began to develop a curriculum focused on healthy relationships, emotional intelligence, and violence prevention, designed to be integrated into existing school programs. As she worked, Sarah thought often of her former students. She wondered how many of them might have benefited from such a program, how many might have been spared the pain she had endured. The thought fueled her determination to make her curriculum as comprehensive and effective as possible. Sarah's work didn't go unnoticed. Word spread through educational circles, and soon she was invited to present her curriculum to the State Board of Education. Standing before the board members, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. "We have a unique opportunity," she told them, her voice passionate but controlled. "By educating our young people about healthy relationships and the red flags of abuse, we can break the cycle before it begins. We can create a generation that understands the value of respect, equality, and personal boundaries." The board was impressed, not just by the curriculum itself, but by Sarah's vision and the personal experience she brought to the project. After a series of rigorous reviews and pilot programs, Sarah's curriculum was approved for implementation across the state. As Sarah watched her program being rolled out in schools, she felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced before. This was more than just sharing her story or supporting individual survivors. This was changing the narrative for future generations. But even as her professional life soared to new heights, Sarah remained committed to her personal growth and healing. She continued her therapy sessions, learning to navigate the complex emotions that sometimes arose from her advocacy work. She practiced self-care diligently, knowing that she could only continue to help others if she took care of herself. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner in her cozy apartment, she received an unexpected call. It was Emily, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Sarah, you won't believe this," Emily said. "Remember that law we've been pushing for, the one to extend the statute of limitations for domestic violence cases? It just passed." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. This was legislation she had testified for, had campaigned tirelessly to support. It meant that survivors who weren't ready to come forward immediately would have more time to seek justice. As she hung up the phone, Sarah was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion. She thought of all the people who had worked so hard to make this happen: advocates, lawmakers, fellow survivors. She thought of the lives this law might change, the hope it might offer to those still suffering in silence. In that moment, standing in her kitchen with tears of joy streaming down her face, Sarah felt the full weight of how far she had come. From a woman trapped in a cycle of abuse, afraid to speak out, she had become a voice for change, a force for good in the world. The next day, Sarah received an invitation that both thrilled and terrified her. A major publishing house wanted her to write a book, not just her memoir, but a comprehensive guide for survivors of domestic abuse, their loved ones, and professionals working in the field. As Sarah sat down to begin this new project, she felt a sense of coming full circle. She remembered the long nights spent writing in secret, pouring her pain and fear onto the pages of a hidden journal. Now, she was writing openly, sharing her story and her hard-won wisdom with the world. The writing process was intense and often emotional. Sarah found herself revisiting painful memories, but also celebrating the strength and resilience she had discovered within herself. She interviewed other survivors, consulted with experts, and poured everything she had learned into the pages of her book. Months passed, and as Sarah wrote the final words of her manuscript, she felt a profound sense of closure. This book represented not just her journey, but the collective wisdom and strength of countless survivors. It was a testament to the human spirit's capacity for healing and growth. On the day of her book launch, Sarah stood before a crowd of supporters, colleagues, and media. As she prepared to read an excerpt, she caught sight of familiar faces in the audience: Emily, Amy, Jessica Walker, members of her support group, even Detective Rodriguez. "This book," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong, is dedicated to every person who has ever felt trapped, afraid, or alone. To those still living in the shadow of abuse, and to those who have found their way to freedom. Your stories matter, your lives matter, and there is always, always hope. As applause filled the room, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude. For her journey, difficult as it had been. For the people who had supported her along the way. For the opportunity to turn her pain into purpose, her struggles into strength. Later that night, as Sarah signed copies of her book, she was approached by a young woman with haunted eyes that reminded her so much of herself years ago. "Your story," the woman whispered, clutching the book to her chest, "it's given me courage. I'm leaving him tomorrow." Sarah embraced the woman, whispering words of encouragement and sliding her a card with contact information for a local support group. As she watched the woman walk away, standing a little taller, Sarah felt the familiar mix of sadness and hope that often accompanied her work. This, she realized, was the true measure of her journey. Not the accolades or the book sales, but the lives touched, the hope kindled, the cycles of abuse broken. In helping others find their strength, Sarah had discovered the full extent of her own. As she left the bookstore that night, stepping out into a world that seemed full of possibility, Sarah Thompson felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold new challenges, new opportunities for growth and change. But she was ready to face whatever came her way, armed with the strength of her experiences and the power of her voice. For Sarah, every day was now an opportunity to heal, to grow, to make a difference. And in that opportunity, she had found true freedom. As the weeks turned into months following her book launch, Sarah found herself navigating a new chapter in her life. Her work had taken on a momentum of its own, opening doors she never imagined possible. She was invited to speak at international conferences, consulted on policy changes, and even approached about turning her story into a film. But with this increased visibility came new challenges. Sarah found herself grappling with the weight of being a public figure, of carrying the hopes and expectations of so many survivors. There were days when the responsibility felt overwhelming, when the constant retelling of her story reopened old wounds. It was during one of these moments of doubt that Sarah received an unexpected email. It was from David's sister, Karen, whom Sarah hadn't spoken to since the trial. "Dear Sarah," the email began, "I've been following your work, and I can't express how proud and sorry I am. Proud of the woman you've become, and sorry for not seeing what was happening, for not believing you sooner. If you're willing, I'd like to meet." Sarah stared at the screen, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. She had always had a good relationship with Karen before things with David deteriorated. The thought of reconnecting was both appealing and terrifying. After discussing it with her therapist and Amy, Sarah decided to meet Karen. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, neutral ground for what promised to be an emotional encounter. As Sarah sat waiting, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, she saw Karen enter. The years had etched new lines around her eyes, but her smile was as kind as Sarah remembered. "Sarah," Karen said softly, taking the seat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." The conversation that followed was difficult but cathartic. Karen shared her own struggle with guilt and denial, the painful process of reconciling the brother she thought she knew with the monster he had become. Sarah spoke of her journey of healing, the challenges and triumphs of the past few years. As they talked, Sarah felt a weight lifting that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Karen's acknowledgement, her apology, helped heal a part of Sarah that was still raw from the disbelief and judgment she'd faced from David's family during the worst years of her marriage. "I want you to know," Karen said as their meeting drew to a close, "that I'm using my voice now too. I'm speaking out about the importance of believing survivors, of recognizing the signs of abuse. Your courage has inspired me to do better, to be better." As they hugged goodbye, Sarah felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. This meeting represented another step in her healing journey, another bridge between her past and her present. Energized by this unexpected resolution, Sarah threw herself back into her work with renewed vigor. She expanded her educational program, working with tech companies to develop an app that could discreetly provide resources and support to people in abusive situations. Her advocacy took her to the halls of power, testifying before Congress on the need for stronger domestic violence laws and better support for survivors. Standing at the podium, looking out at the rows of legislators, Sarah felt the weight of every survivor's story she carried with her. "Distinguished members of Congress," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I come before you not just as a survivor, but as a representative of millions of voices, some silenced forever, others still crying out in the dark. We have the power to change lives, to save lives, with the decisions we make here today." Her testimony was powerful, moving several legislators to tears and sparking a renewed commitment to addressing domestic violence on a national level. As she left the Capitol building, Sarah was approached by a senior senator. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, shaking her hand firmly, "your words today were truly impactful. We're forming a special committee to draft comprehensive legislation on domestic violence prevention and survivor support. We'd be honored if you'd consider serving as a special advisor." Sarah accepted, recognizing the opportunity to effect change at the highest levels. As she immersed herself in the complex world of policymaking, she never lost sight of the individual lives at stake. Each provision, each clause, represented a potential lifeline for someone trapped in an abusive situation. As her influence grew, Sarah also became increasingly aware of the global nature of domestic violence. She began partnering with international organizations, sharing her curriculum and advocacy strategies with women's groups around the world. During a trip to a women's shelter in a small town in India, Sarah met Priya, a young woman whose story of survival and resilience deeply touched her. Despite language barriers, the two women connected on a profound level, their shared experiences transcending cultural differences. Inspired by Priya and the other women she met, Sarah started a global network of survivor advocates, creating a platform for women around the world to share their stories, strategies, and support. The network grew rapidly, becoming a powerful force for change on a global scale. Back home, Sarah continued to balance her public role with her personal journey of healing. She took up painting as a form of therapy, finding peace in the flow of colors across canvas. Her art became another way to express her experiences, to transform pain into beauty. One evening, as Sarah was putting the finishing touches on a painting in her small home studio, she received a call from Amy. Her sister's voice was filled with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. "Sarah," Amy said, "I've been thinking, what if we started a foundation? A place that could bring together all the different aspects of your work, education, advocacy, support for survivors. We could make an even bigger impact." The idea took root, growing and evolving over late-night discussions and strategy sessions. Sarah and Amy poured their hearts into creating the Freedom and Healing Foundation, an organization dedicated to breaking the cycle of domestic violence through education, advocacy, and direct support for survivors. The day of the foundation's launch was a milestone Sarah could never have imagined during her darkest days. As she stood on stage, surrounded by supporters, colleagues, and fellow survivors, Sarah felt a profound sense of purpose. "This foundation," she told the assembled crowd, "is not just about me or my story. It's about every person who has ever felt trapped, afraid, or alone. It's about creating a world where domestic violence is a relic of the past, where every person can live free from fear in their own home." As the years passed, Sarah watched the seeds she had planted grow and flourish. Her curriculum was adopted in schools across the country and around the world. The Foundation's shelter program provided safe havens for thousands of survivors. Their legal advocacy team worked tirelessly to change laws and protect victims' rights. On the 10th anniversary of her trial, Sarah found herself back in Oakville. The small town had changed, as had she, but there was a familiarity that tugged at her heart. She walked through the quiet streets, past her old house, the high school where she once taught, the courthouse where her life had changed forever. As she stood on the steps of the courthouse, Sarah was struck by how far she had come. From a woman trapped in a cycle of abuse, she had become a beacon of hope, a catalyst for change, a voice for the voiceless. A young reporter approached her, notebook in hand. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "you've accomplished so much in the past decade. What's next for you?" Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with purpose. "What's next is what's always been there, the work. As long as there are people suffering in silence, as long as there are systems that fail to protect the vulnerable, there is work to be done. And I'll be there, doing it." As the sun set over Oakville, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Sarah Thompson stood tall, her heart full of gratitude, hope, and an unwavering commitment to the journey ahead. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her trauma into triumph. And in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her own life but had helped countless others reclaim theirs. Sarah knew that the road ahead would have its challenges. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, new battles to fight. But she was ready, for in her darkest moments, she had discovered a light within herself, a light that now shone as a beacon for others, guiding them towards freedom, healing, and hope. As she turned to leave, Sarah caught her reflection in the courthouse window. The woman looking back at her was strong, compassionate, and filled with purpose. She was a survivor, an advocate, a changemaker. But most of all, she was Sarah Thompson, unbroken, unbowed, and unafraid to keep fighting for a better world. With a deep breath and a determined step, Sarah walked away from the courthouse, ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. Her journey had taught her that even the deepest wounds could heal, that the human spirit was capable of incredible resilience, and that one voice, raised in truth and courage, could change the world. And so, as the stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, Sarah Thompson continued on her path, her heart full of hope, her spirit unbroken, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, one day, one voice, one life at a time. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings.